Well, welcome, viewers and listeners, to another edition of CHP Talks. I'm here with a repeat guest, Mr. Tom Harris, coming to us from Ottawa. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's good to be on. I'm just going to check that my volume is okay. Yeah, it looks good.
And Tom, for those who may not have tuned in on our previous episodes where Tom has been our guest, he is the executive director of ICSC Canada. That's the International Climate Science Coalition, a federally incorporated not-for-profit coalition of scientists, economists, and energy and policy experts working to promote a better understanding of climate science and to foster a rational, evidence-based discussion about sensible and realistic responses to climate change. Mr. Harris has over 40 years' experience as a mechanical engineer, project manager, science and technology communications professional technical trainer, and science and technology advisor to a former opposition senior environment critic in Canada's Parliament. For the past 24 years, he's been working with a team of scientists and engineers to promote a sensible approach to a range of energy and environmental topics, climate change in particular. Mr. Harris is regularly published in newspapers in Canada and the US, and occasionally in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and other countries. He's often interviewed on radio and occasionally on television. Mr. Harris is the past executive director of the Natural Resources Stewardship Project, and he's one of hundreds of policy advisors to the Heartland Institute. So we're so thankful that you were able to squeeze some time for us today, Mr. Harris. And I know what came to my attention a couple of weeks ago. I saw in one of your emails you mentioned a new book out, and maybe we'll start there. Your book, Energy and Climate at a Glance.
Yeah, for sure. Here's the book. It's a booklet, really, although it has 88 pages. And it's put out by a group called Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy and the Heartland Institute. Those are the publishers. I'm a contributing author. And the thing that's nice about it is it's very easy read. And it has things summed up, and nice little factoids and that sort of thing. And so this is called Energy and Climate at a Glance, Canadian edition. And I'll just show people how to order it. If I share my screen here,
Sure,
I'll show you our homepage.
Those who are viewing on the video podcast, you can see it here. It's icsc-canada.com is the website.
Yeah, that's right. And on the homepage, the upper right-hand box, which I'll just scroll down to. Let's see here. There we go. You can see it has a link, and you purchase here. Click on there, and it takes you to Energy and Climate at a Glance, a guide. This is a Canadian edition, and this is just put out literally about 8 days ago, and you can order it right here. Okay, so when people scroll down, we invite you to order the book. It's including shipping and tax. It comes out to $22, and if you commit to delivering a copy of the book to a leading Canadian politician, investment fund analyst, media journalist, or other prominent figure, we'll give you that extra book for free. So yeah, all you do is you put in $22 right here, and then you write us a comment, say, for the green book, okay? And then we'll have it to you as soon as the strike's over.
Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
you live in Ottawa, in which case you can pick it up right from my home.
There are some things beyond our control, like postal strikes and possibly climate change.
Yeah, that's for
So,
sure.
so very good. Look forward to getting a copy of that. It's unfortunate that we have this postal strike, especially right now
Oh, at
for
Christmas, yeah.
Christmas. It's a terrible
Yeah.
time.
So I should just emphasize what's in the book. I forgot to say.
Yeah, let's do that.
It's Yeah, exactly. Well, it starts out with an introduction and what are Canada's commitments, okay? Because we hear all kinds of interpretations, and it talks about then the economic and social impacts of doing that. And then we have a complete chapter on the fact that It's not necessary if you see from
Right.
this headline here. Computer model projections don't reflect real temperatures. And of course, the climate scare is based entirely on computer models. And another section called What Will the Sacrifice Cost? So we then end off with some policy recommendations. And of course, the most obvious one is to adapt to climate change because climate changes all the time and there's no chance that we have of controlling it. Our contribution is minuscule in comparison with nature. So, yeah, the whole point of this book is to give something to people to put it under the Christmas tree for their for their children. It's an excellent book for high school and university students as well. And yeah, we'd be happy to send you. Have a box here of 300 of them. I'd be happy to send them out.
Wonderful. That's really good to know, and I look forward to having my own copy of that book. And so, speaking about policies and politicians, um, I recently ran in a BC provincial election here, and when it comes to climate change, there was a lady who talked to me afterwards, and of course, she was um, insulted that I would say that there was anything wrong with the current, excuse me, climate change narrative that we've been living under for all these years. She said she and her husband are scientists, and of course, these are all peer-reviewed things. And I asked her if she would be interested in seeing some information coming from you, and she wasn't interested because, of course, she knows all about it. And I thought that was unfortunate if people are so set in their mind has been made up by an official narrative. What can you say in general about that, Tom?
Yeah, for sure. Well, of course, the old expression is their minds are like concrete, all mixed up and permanently set.
Hmm.
But what I can say about that is that at the bottom of every page in our book are references. And these are scientific references. You know, for example, if I look towards the end here, I'm up to reference number 108. So it's fully referenced. Everything in the book is fully referenced. One thing people don't realize is that truth does not apply to science. Truth is universal, necessary, and certain. Okay, those are the aspects of truth according to Plato. And in the case of science, it's really just our interpretation of the data based on our observations. And you know, people interpret data differently. People have different data. So it's interesting. There's a professor at Lehigh University in Chicago, Professor Goldman. He's a philosophy professor, although his basic undergraduate was in physics. And he agrees with Al Gore that there is a climate problem. But he says that the whole idea that it's truth, because you remember Al Gore calls it an inconvenient truth, he says no. He said that doesn't apply in science. It's just our current opinion based on our interpretation of the data. And of course, we can be wrong. So the bottom line is that first of all, truth doesn't apply. Just let me have a cough here. I'm just getting over a bug. I'll just mute my mic.
Yeah. So yeah, that's really something you can, if you probe on the internet, you can find old TV commercials. You know, there's a doctor sitting there smoking a cigarette and says, "Boy, you know, these whatever Lucky Strikes or whatever, these are the best cigarettes, and I enjoy them all the time in between patients." You know,
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
was
well, and you know, climate science is probably the most complicated science we've ever tackled. Okay, so I mean, it's even more complicated than building the atomic bomb. And you know, it's interesting because some professors, like Chris Essex from University of Western Ontario, he says that because the climate is so unbelievably complex with so many input variables, etc., it's quite possible that we'll never be able to forecast climate to any reasonable degree of accuracy. And if you go back 30 years in the past, and you plug in the conditions that existed into the computer models, you know, the temperature and the density at that time, what you find is that it forecasts, the computer models on average forecast about 3 times as much warming as actually has happened in the real world.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so one of the things we do in this book is we go back in time to look at past geologic changes, okay, and actually say what happened in the real world when CO2 was much higher. And CO2 was in fact much higher many times in Earth's history. In fact, right now we're in a CO2 famine. We're much closer to lower levels of CO2 where plants start to die than we are at any upper limit. You know, it's interesting because at one point in Earth's history, the planet was stuck in what's called an ice house, where the whole planet, including even the ocean, some scientists believe, was covered with ice. That was the coldest time. And yet, the CO2 was 10 times higher than today. And I don't mean like a 50% rise since 1880, which is what we've seen. I mean 1,000%. And yet we were stuck in a cold period. So the data just doesn't back it up. So I mean, that's one of the reasons that we're quite disappointed with Pierre Polyev. And did you want to get onto that topic?
Sure. You mentioned that you had some things to discuss about his approach to climate and CO2, and
Yeah.
you and I have chatted about that before. But go ahead. Let's hear what Mr.
Well,
Polyev has to say about climate.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I congratulate you on your webpage on environment because your discussion of the real things that we should be going after, like real pollution, air, land, and water pollution, and not going after CO2, which of course is anything but pollution. It's plant food. Your webpage is actually perfect. Like I like to actually try and encourage the parties to be correct in these things, but I don't have to encourage you at all because yours is already perfect. But the bottom line is that Pierre Polyev, sadly, is supporting the climate scare. And I spoke to his campaign manager when he was running to be leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and he wouldn't quite come out and say Pierre knows there's no climate crisis, but it was pretty obvious that he didn't believe it. But regardless, he wants to be prime minister, and he has this idea, and so do his advisors, and it's wrong, by the way, that to become prime minister, you have to support the climate scare. So if you go back in time to the time before Stephen Harper was prime minister, when he was head of the Canadian Alliance Party at first, he wrote a letter to Canadian Alliance donors in which he said, and this is paraphrasing, he said it was a Kyoto Protocol was a money-sucking socialist scheme. Now, he didn't actually necessarily use the words in that order, but that's what he said. Money-sucking socialist was in there. And yet, of course, a little later, 2 years later, he was heading up the Conservative Party of Canada. So his position obviously didn't slow him down at all. And then when he was supporting the Conservative Party of Canada, he said the same thing. The science is very uncertain, that, we are causing dangerous climate change. And yet then he became prime minister. So obviously you don't have to support the climate scare to become prime minister. And of course, we obviously saw it in the United States, where Trump has been very derogatory towards the whole climate scare. And he said that the climate scare is a plot to give the Chinese more power. Well, I don't know if it's a plot, but it certainly is giving them a lot more power because they're the main suppliers of wind and solar power. So Trump got elected too, two out of 3 times, opposing the climate scare. And yet you think about it, Andrew Scheer and O'Toole, both of them lost, even though they were proposing climate change plans and they were accepting the mantra. So right now, the idea that Pierre has to support the climate scare to get elected is obviously wrong. Okay, now here's the scary thing. Even though Harper was very much opposed to the climate scare and was not afraid to bring up the science aspects, after he got into power, he changed sides. And he ended up supporting the Copenhagen Accord, for example. And he supported the Cancun Accord and the various other accords that were leading up to the Paris Agreement, which came into force shortly after he lost the election. So, and at that point, he lost the election, even though he was supporting the climate scare. So the correlation between winning elections and losing elections in climate or not isn't there. And yet, strangely, Pierre Poilievre now supports three things, which obviously show that he's not prepared to contest the science. He says that we have to have carbon sequestration and collection and sequestration. He says we have to have electric vehicles and we have to have developing countries going off their coal and moving over to clean Canadian natural gas to stop climate change. But we don't have to do any of those things. Okay. So he's promoting the climate scare. So the thing that scares me about Pierre is that if Stephen Harper opposed the climate scare and then changed his position to support it when he became in power, Pierre Poilievre is supporting the climate scare even before becoming prime minister. So I think we're in for a big shock. I think a lot of conservatives are in for a big shock. In fact, I'm going to write an article about this because, they seem to think that axe the tax, that's the solution. Well, no, actually, the tax is just a symptom of the disease. And the disease is the whole climate scare. So, yeah, if you get rid of one aspect of it, yeah, okay, maybe that 10% is gone. But there's so much other things going on the climate issue. So Pierre Poilievre's advisors clearly think he has to support the scare, but they're wrong. They're simply wrong. And I think that they're just too junior to understand or to look back in history and say, hey, Harper didn't support it and he got elected. Yeah. So I really encourage people to vote for the Christian Heritage Party because, quite frankly, your position on climate change is completely perfect.
Well, wonderful. That's a great recommendation from someone who basically you spend all your time and energy investigating the details of this, probably in a much deeper way than I have time to do. But thank you for that endorsement. And we certainly, you convinced me last spring that we have to do more than just axe the tax. We have to defend carbon dioxide, which is not a pollutant. It is plant food. It is necessary for the health of our planet, and human race will benefit from carbon dioxide. Now, there may be other things. There are other problems with some of emissions, and it's not carbon dioxide. That's what I want to make clear. We have to ensure, like, there is such a thing as pollution.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We oppose pollution, but carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It is a natural beneficial gas. It's part of our cycle of life in this wonderful planet we live in.
Yeah, and we have to recognize that we've done enormously well with respect to reducing real pollution. I mean, a car today puts out something like 1/20th the real pollution of a car from the 1970s. So, yeah, we've done quite well on this. Now, it doesn't mean that we should stop and rest in our laurels, but the fact is we have done quite well, and Canada, generally speaking, is a very clean country.
And as many have pointed out, it is the use of carbon-based fuels that has allowed the growth in living, or the improvement in living conditions, and the growth of economies around the world, including our own. And
that's right. And I'll point out one thing quick. People often ask me, what's the most important invention of the 20th century? And they'll say, is it rockets? Is it the internet? What is it? What is the most important invention? Well, what I tell them is I say the most important invention, which is currently keeping half the world alive, is the invention of inorganic fertilizers. And in particular, the Haber-Bosch process, where you reform natural gas to produce ammonia, which is NH3. And with ammonia, then, that is basically the nitrogen fertilizer you need for plants to survive. But here's the crazy thing, Rod. About 60% in Ontario, and probably about the same in BC, about 60% of the ammonia they put down is absorbed by plants. The rest of it runs into the water table and actually is real pollution. And the thing that happens then is it reacts with microbes in the soil, the runoff, ammonia runoff, and it produces something called nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is N2O. That's what you breathe in at the dentist, if you're having that kind of anesthetic. And what they say is my goodness, per molecule, nitrous oxide is much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Well, what they, the crazy thing is, they don't tell you the whole story. Carbon dioxide is increasing 3,000 times faster than nitrous oxide. So it turns out that the overall contribution of nitrous oxide, the amount that it's growing, which is very small, it's measured in parts per billion, is only about 1/13th that of carbon dioxide. And we already know that carbon dioxide isn't causing a problem because we've had a 50% rise since 1880 and temperatures have gone up only 1.2 degrees. So obviously we're at a point now where the atmosphere is not very sensitive to CO2. But it turns out it's not very sensitive to N2O either. Or the third big boogeyman in the whole picture is methane, and it too shows that you could double methane, and very little would happen. So the science that bases, that is the backing, so-called, of the federal government's war on farming, which is what is, I'm also hoping we can talk about. That, in fact, is bogus. I mean, the science doesn't add up. Farmers have an incentive to be very efficient in their use of fertilizer, of course, because it's very expensive. But the last thing they need to do is realize or pretend that it's causing dangerous climate change, because it isn't.
So, yeah, let's talk about farming for a bit, and the fact that, especially as it relates to animal husbandry, or the raising of meat animals, meat and dairy, and egg production and so on. There's all this hypertension right now about what cattle contribute to, as you say, with methane and so on. You know
Yeah.
what? I've just watched a documentary by Ken Burns on the buffalo, and they used to cover the plains with millions and millions of buffalo, and there was nobody screaming about, global warming caused by, and they were basically like beef animals, and there were many more of them than are now currently in the cattle industry. So, what's the deal about methane and why should people not be uh, falling into this trap of thinking that farmers are causing global warming?
Yeah, well, I'll share a screen with you if you don't mind,
Yeah, go
which
ahead.
actually shows some recent research that was done by Will Happer and other scientists. Will is from Princeton University, and interestingly enough, Will Happer was actually the science advisor for Trump for a year, but he said that he couldn't he couldn't fight the deep state. But yeah, so I'll zip down here to methane. I have some numbers actually in my presentation. Oh, by the way, just before we go on, I wanted to show you a couple of things. People say, "Well, who cares?" I mean, it's just climate change. What does it cost the farmers? Okay, and I'll just can you see that slide for my?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, good. So what I'll do is I'll put on slideshow here so it
Yeah,
fills the whole screen. It turns out carbon tax, like I have a Dodge Grand Caravan, and on gasoline, it's 17.6 cents per liter. Okay. Now, that means every time I fill up my tank, because they tax the tax, okay, they
right.
actually tax the carbon tax, if you can believe that. I'm
Unreal.
spending over $15 on carbon tax every time I fill up. However, by 2030, this will be over $32 that I'll be
Oh,
paying on gasoline for my Dodge Grand Caravan if it's still running in 2030. Now, here's the kicker, and this is why food prices are going to skyrocket. This is a large Peterbilt truck that they use to ship cattle, because you were just bringing up cattle. They now pay 21.39 cents per liter on diesel fuel. And it means currently, because these are huge tanks, say about 300-gallon tanks, they currently pay $329, including HST, just for the carbon tax every time they fill up. And here's the kicker. By 2030, they'll be paying $700 in carbon tax every time they fill up their tank. It's ridiculous.
That's
I mean, they'll be spending a
unbelievable.
third as much as the whole cost of the fuel. And that'll just be on Trudeau's carbon tax. So, of course, that's going to get added to the price of food and everything else that's shipped for that matter. Now, just go on. Here's propane. By 2030, it'll be 5.29 every time you fill up. Now, here's every time you're going to. Now, here's the interesting one for natural gas. Most homes in Canada are heated with natural gas. By 2030, you'll be paying $838 a year on carbon tax. Now, for farmers, they have grain dryers, okay, and they're trying to get Bill C-206 passed, which would exempt on-farm grain drying. But I mean, most farmers can't afford these massive machines, so they use community grain dryers. And here's the cost. My goodness, they're saying that the total cost of carbon tax indirected is going to reach $160 an acre. Now, these big farms are like 1,000 acres. So they'll be paying $160,000 just to dry their farm in tax, in carbon tax. Now, it's interesting because the numbers, the amount of money the federal government is collecting is huge. As I say here, total proceeds for the carbon tax at over $80 billion. Is how much they're taking in. And of course, they're taking that out of our economy. Now, the whole idea, of course, is that we're driving climate change. And I just wanted to show you one really interesting GIF. Okay, it's a moving GIF, and it shows, and this is essentially what convinced me that, we really don't have a climate issue. Take a look at the correlation or the lack thereof between atmospheric CO2 and global temperature over Earth's history. Now, this is really interesting. It's supposed to be going in lockstep, according to the environmentalists, but it's all over the map.
Mm.
Okay, it just doesn't match it at all. And so the real world data does not support the climate scare. In fact, it says that geologically speaking, we're in a CO2 famine. Okay. And in fact, we're much closer to that lower dangerous level. Now, I just wanted to show you an interesting graph. I'll have to zip ahead here. And it's a bit complicated, but it's really worth understanding. This helps put things in perspective, by the way, this graph. This shows the temperature change that we normally see. But Patrick Moore took the data and instead of plotting, on the vertical axis with 0.5 degree increments, which is just about nothing, you wouldn't even feel that. He put it on a normal sort of graph, which goes from, in this case, let's see, from 0 Fahrenheit up to 110. And this is the existential threat.
Mm.
You can see it right here. No, it's not there. But I'll just zip ahead. Oh, yeah, here's the graph I wanted to show. This graph here. What this shows is the amount of radiation escaping to space, which is the vertical axis, which is the purple, okay? If there was no greenhouse gases, that's how much energy would be escaping to space at different wavelengths at the top of the atmosphere. But because we have all the different greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, water vapor especially, that's the big one, nitrous oxide and methane, the actual amount is somewhat less. Okay, so that shows you what it really is. Now, the black, okay, F equals 1, is what it would look like, what it looks like today with today's level of CO2. If we double CO2, in other words, the red right here, that's the change. It's tiny. It's very, very small. If we go from 0 parts per million CO2, which is the green, to today's level, there's a big reduction in radiation to space. But the atmosphere is pretty well saturated for CO2 at this point, so we can double CO2, and you can see the change here is very, very small. Look at this. You can hardly even see it.
Yeah.
That's with a doubling of CO2.
Wow.
So I'll stop sharing, but that same curve actually applies to methane and nitrous oxide as well. The doubling of those gases doesn't result in much at all. In
Yeah.
fact, it's resulting in tiny fractions of a degree. So the whole impetus behind the CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide reduction drive that they're trying to force on farmers, it's wrong. It just simply doesn't apply.
Yeah, and then of course Jagmeet Singh will try to blame it on greedy supermarket managers and owners of businesses rather
Yeah.
than accepting the fact that it is their carbon tax that has been primarily, and their overspending on everything else that has driven inflation and made it difficult for Canadians to afford groceries. Then they turn
Yeah.
around with a boutique handout at Christmas time to try to avoid total political collapse in the next federal election, which we hope Canadians aren't stupid enough to fall for that. Can you just very briefly give us a little explanation what they mean by carbon capture and sequestration? I'm not a fan of these in any sense, but people hear these words bandied about, and maybe you can speak to them a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. It's relatively easy to remove pollutants from the effluents from coal stations, let's say, or from natural gas stations. But it's actually quite difficult to take the carbon dioxide out. And this is what they're concerned about, of course, with respect to climate change, because about 80% of all the greenhouse gases that we release, if you don't count water vapor, is carbon dioxide. So what they do is they put in very complicated technology into the smokestack that comes out of a carbon or a coal plant or a natural gas plant, and they pull the carbon dioxide out. They put it into a pipe. They pipe it long distances under pressure to a sequestration site. In other words, it's a site where they've actually found that the ground is stable enough that they can pump CO2 into the ground, and hopefully it'll stay for a while. So at that point, they compress it even more, and they put it in the ground and they seal it off. So it's the carbon capture at the power station and sequestration at the sequestration site. Now, there's a real problem with that. I mean, first of all, it takes about a third of the energy from a coal station to take out its carbon dioxide. So that means you're getting a third less electricity. And of course, you're producing a lot more pollution, real pollution. So, in an effort to reduce a non pollutant, which is carbon dioxide, they are increasing real pollution, which I always find kind of ironic to say the least. And also, of course, you're wasting a third of all of your electricity. So, they're very inefficient power plants. And in fact, it's interesting because Bob Murray, he's passed away, unfortunately, but he was a coal company executive in the United States. And he was one of these people who had more skin in the game than most people because it was a private coal company and he wanted it to continue. He owned the company and he was going to pass it on to his children, his sons in particular, who were vice presidents. So he actually testified before Congress about carbon sequestration. And of course, we shouldn't call it carbon. I mean, it's not carbon. That's graphite or diamonds or soot. But he testified before Congress about sequestration, and he said carbon sequestration is code for no coal. Because the big benefit of coal, of course, assuming you put in proper pollution control, is that it's very inexpensive. It's very secure, okay? Because you pile up a year and a half, 2 years supply right on site. You don't have to worry about pipelines coming in, delivering you your daily natural gas. You pile it up on site. So, I mean, coal is a wonderful resource. And if, in fact, you use it and burn it cleanly, which you can, you actually have a really great, inexpensive source of power. In fact, China and India get most of their electricity from coal. And they're not going to stop, by the way. They've made that really clear. So Bob Murray said that the carbon sequestration is code for no coal. And that's a real tragedy because coal is a wonderful energy source. We have centuries worth of coal supply in the future. I have nothing against coal. I think coal is great. Natural gas is wonderful, but natural gas is a special fuel. It's wonderful for home heating, for example, whereas coal is really great for base load electricity. In fact, replacing coal with natural gas, I've heard it referred to as a reverse Midas touch. In other words, turning gold into lead. Because we should save our natural gas for home heating and for pharmaceuticals and producing, they even use it for producing various products. I mean, that's what we should save our natural gas for, not for, base load electricity generation. That doesn't make any sense. That should be done by hydro, by nuclear, by coal. Those should be our main sources of base load power, with using natural gas as a peaking source, because you can easily ramp up and down natural gas stations. And that's why, of course, they're using natural gas to back up wind power. And it's really interesting because Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he says, well, you realize the mandate to increase wind power is really a mandate to build more natural gas stations, because we need them to back it up for when the wind isn't blowing.
Yeah.
But, and most recently, I don't know if you heard, but at the COP conference, the Conference of the Parties, that was held in Azerbaijan, which I think was quite funny. Baku, which is the capital of Azerbaijan, and which is the location of the UN climate conference, that is the world's first oil town. Okay, the world's first oil town. Even Marco Polo spoke about oil being used in Baku. In fact, at one point, Baku, around 1900, Baku produced something like half of all the world's oil was coming out of Azerbaijan, and in particular out of Baku. So it's quite ironic that they'd be holding a UN climate conference to get rid of oil in what was in fact the first oil town in the world, back to around 300 AD. And I don't know if you saw the introductory presentation from the president of Azerbaijan, but he said, oil, coal, and gas are a gift from God. And okay, the environmentalists went crazy. Well, of course it is. Of course it's a gift from God. It's a natural resource. And he said point blank, he said, you shouldn't blame countries who are developing their God-given natural resources and providing it to a market that really wants it. So, it was quite funny. They didn't really get much in the way of agreement for reduction in greenhouse gases. But what they did do is they tripled our $100 billion a year bill that we're going to be presented from the developing countries for the damage we supposedly caused. They tripled it to $300 billion starting next year. And their target, believe it or not, Rod, their target is $1.3 trillion a year. So this is a infinite money machine for the developing world, but it'll have no impact on climate.
That is amazing. So, what kind, as you say, didn't get much in the way of agreements. Anything come out of that COP29, the conference, that particularly we need to be concerned about, other than their plans for the future?
Well, I don't think so, because they don't have it as mandatory. Like, they don't have an enforceable framework to force countries to pay. And one thing people don't realize is that the Paris Agreement is not legally binding. Okay, it's not legally binding. Some countries, foolish countries like Canada under Trudeau, are actually making it legally binding within their country, but we don't actually have to do it. I mean, it's an optional thing. But we go through all those details in our book. I'm circling back to our book here. See, look, domestic CO2 restrictions are futile and harmful. Okay, because we don't want to reduce CO2. It's interesting. Patrick Moore pointed out that we're much closer to very low levels and dangerously low levels of CO2. During the last glacial period, CO2 got down to about 180 parts per million. Today it's at 420, which sounds high until you look into the more distant past and you realize it was 4,000 parts per million, not 400. So, what Patrick points out is that naturally speaking, CO2 has been dropping for millennia. Okay, and if we hadn't intervened to burn fossil fuels and to make cement and do other things that release CO2, he said, and this is incredible, but you can check it on the web. He says in his presentations that we were headed down to the end of life on Earth because CO2 levels were headed down in a direction that would take it down to 150 parts per million, where plants start to die. And then, of course, all life on Earth starts to die. So he says we saved life on Earth with our CO2 emissions. It's interesting because there's a fair number of agricultural experts who say point blank, we should hope that CO2 doubles because it's aerial fertilizer. It's enriching the planet. We're having much more crop yield than we did 50 years ago, largely because there's more CO2 in the air. So I hear scientists saying, let's hope it doubles to 800 parts per million. Okay. Because, I mean, it's been much higher than that in the past. In fact, today's plants that we have in our environment mostly evolved at a time when CO2 was much higher. And of course, that's why they pump CO2 into greenhouses. They don't do it to poison anybody. They do it because the plants grow better. They don't need as much water. So, yeah, of course, CO2 is great. We shouldn't worry about it. We should do what you say on your website, namely focus on real pollution and, of course, adaptation to climate change. If you're living beside the sea level, right at sea level, and oceans are rising naturally, yeah, you better build a seawall or move away from the coast. It's interesting, Rod. There was a time about 8,000 years ago when we were coming out of the last glacial still, when sea level rose 10 times faster than today. So today's sea level rise is not abnormal at all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, very, very good. Tom Harris, what a pleasure to have you on the program, and we value your in-depth knowledge and understanding of this and your tireless advocacy. I thank you that you are speaking not only to us, but to people in the other parties, the Polyev crowd, and trying to influence their decision making with sound science. And I think that's, we are seen as a party that we're certainly concerned about many other issues, abortion, maid, gender issues, all those kind of things. But we're not afraid to take on positions that may at the moment be unpopular, because the popular idea about any of these issues can be wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And
Well, I tell disaffected conservatives who say, oh my God, Pierre Poilievre supporting the climate scare. What should we do? I say, well, vote Christian Heritage Party, because take a look at their website. It's absolutely perfect. If that's your main concern, then the CHP are the people to vote for. And of course, there's a whole lot of other reasons to vote for you as well, because the conservatives are frightened of abortion and, LGBT stuff. In fact, I thought it was funny in your speech. It was so appropriate. You said, so people say that we don't want to vote for Trudeau because of these issues. So we'll vote for the other party that also has the same issues. It's crazy.
yeah,
So,
no, that's right.
obviously you have to vote with your conscience, because the bottom line is that these issues are much too important to just play politics with. And I wish to heaven that Pierre Poilievre would wake up and say what's real. But in the meantime, yeah, people should support CHP.
Well, and we have said this about abortion for years, but if people who care about the issues like abortion or like this scientific approach to climate and so on, if they would actually vote their conscience, whether or not a particular CHP candidate gets elected, the people like Pierre Poilievre are going to look at the polling results, and if they see, it's like they've been sold a bill of goods. They've been told that CO2 is a losing issue, like that they're afraid to talk about the things that you and I have been discussing, because they think, well, that'll cost us votes. If they actually saw people voting for a party that endorses sound scientific approach and moral values, it should influence them. And of course, if it influences them, then that should also influence people like Mr. Trudeau, if he's subject to any any influence of common sense and scientific approach to life.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we thank you for joining us. And folks, again, ICSC hyphen, what I had that in front of me, except
Canada.com.
.com.
And you can order this book, even though there's a strike on now. We've got, 100 people have ordered the books. I have 300 sitting here. So you should order it soon because eventually we're going to run out on the first print run. But this book is a wonderful stocking stuffer, whatever. I can't pronounce myself. But the bottom line is, yeah, it'll roll up nicely and go in a stocking. And it's a good thing to give to your climate alarmist child to help them sleep at night because this is child abuse, all this scare tactic. It's just not real.
So I'm going to put just for a moment here, put this your page on up on the screen here. So it's
Yeah, great.
again icsc-canada.com, and
Yeah, perfect.
that's where you can find this energy and climate at a glance and order it. And hopefully by the time you place the order, and hopefully very soon our postal strike will be over, and you can enjoy the opportunity to fill your head with these facts that you may need when you're in discussions with your neighbor.
Yeah, for sure.
Just 1 second, I got to stop this share. And so we'll close off here. And Tom, thanks again for taking the time to spend with us. We really appreciate it. You have a wonderful Christmas season and a winter season, and may common sense and scientific truth prevail in the new year.
Yeah, let's hope so.